Thank you very much, Clemens. And we continue with the next speaker, who is Alexis Drach from Université Paris 8, Vincennes, who has a background, is an assistant professor of modern history there, and he has a background in economic history with a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, where he has also been part of several big research projects with a focus, I understand, on banking regulation, especially banking regulation. We will hear from him today about the development of the banking and financial sectors in Germany and France in the second half of the 20th century. Voilà.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I think it's very interesting for financial historians. I think comparing German and French banking history is not so frequently done in banking history, and I think it's a very interesting area of research. So I will try to use, how can I use this? Yeah, okay. So just as a disclaimer, I have to say I'm not an expert on German banking history. Initially, I used to work on banking regulation and then on French and British banking history. So I will do my best to try to make comparative perspective. I think it's very interesting. Actually, it's something I'm starting to work on now. I'm starting to work on German banking history too. But so that's something which is still ongoing. So. When we think of French and German banking sectors after World War II, a few things can come to mind in terms of differences and similarities. So first of all, regarding similarities, of course, these countries can be considered as bank-based, even though that's something that can be discussed, of course. I just put some check on the time. Yeah. So bank-based systems, savings and cooperative banks were existing in both countries, even though they were more important in Germany. And universal banks existed in both countries, even though, of course, Germany was a model country for universal banking. But particularly from 1966 onwards in France, also there was a tendency of going back to this kind of universal banking approach. And also, I've written this on this question of regulatory system based on written law. And that's something that came to my mind also when working on the British banking history, because that's exactly how they perceived when they entered the European Economic Community in the 1970s, how they tended to perceive what they called continental banking, which sometimes they perceived as a homogeneous whole, but particularly Italian, French, and German banking were perceived by British banks as banks working in a very written regulatory environment, as opposed to the tradition of informal way of doing regulation in the UK at that time. Of course, in the differences, it's hard not to mention the role of the state in France, particularly in the late 40s and the 1950s. It's very important in the reconstruction moment, in the financing economic growth also. In France, there was this kind of centralized banking system. I mean, it's centered around Paris. Of course, it's probably quite also interesting to look at. I mean, there's been several works looking at the profile of the financial elites, focusing mostly on the big banks more than on small or medium banks. But it's something quite interesting to look at. And of course, because in France, the involvement with the state was quite important. The big financial elite of the big banks were often former civil servant, high civil servant coming from the treasury. So when looking at people, also you can see kind of different kind of trajectories, different kind of profile. And the question is also, what about the trajectories in this second half of the 20th century? To some extent, we could argue that German banks and French banks faced somehow similar challenges, like during the golden age of economic growth in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, facing also the rise of the euro-dollar market, American competition, and so on and so forth. But they also were embedded in their own national history, in their own national economic policies also. So it's, I wouldn't say actually that the trajectories were very completely similar. There were quite strong differences. And the question of convergence and divergence has been something that's been also looked at by the financial history literature. And usually the answer to the question is often negative. Which is not necessarily perceived as a bad thing, but it's also for historians something interesting to look to realize how persistent can national patterns can be, even though at the end of the 20th century there is like globalization, European integration, the advent of economic and monetary union, which we could assume would push towards convergence, but at least until the 1990s, there still were very important differences in the national structures, if I may say. So I would try to do some kind of comparative history, but I will talk a little bit more of the French side, but also I will try to mention a few, like some kind of connected history, where how German and French banking histories actually met, in which occasions. So starting with the so-called golden age of after the Second World War. So first of all, the two countries were in very different situations. In Germany, there was the presence of the Allied countries, which had also forced the breaking up of big banks into regional banks. France was in a very different situation. In France, there was this kind of very specific feature called the treasury circuit. So some kind of broad economic architecture organized around the treasury, and that was already dating back to the early 1940s. But it continued in the late 40s and in the 1950s. It was disbanded progressively in the 1960s, and that was basically a way to organize the financial sector as a source of funding for the state, so that the state would not have to ask for the central bank for printing money, basically. So that was a very broad system, basically used to so that the public, the treasury could access large parts of deposits in the entire country. So most private and public or semi-public institutions had to have lots of treasury bonds in their portfolios. So there were all kinds of regulations trying to make all the savings of the country converge towards the treasury, so that they would have some substantial financing available to finance also first the reconstruction, but then the planification orientation, which was a major element of post-war French economic policies. So, and of course that was a difference with Germany. So in that sense, also this kind of the whole banking sector was also part of this kind of broader political economy. So, because it's like trying to cover the whole century is quite challenging, so I will move a bit fast over time, but we can come back during the discussion on various points. And another element which came up at the end of the 1950s and which really developed in the 1960s was the rise of the euro-dollar market. And this concerned, of course, not only German and French banks, several, all the big banks and international-oriented banks were concerned by this. So this was basically dollars bought and sold outside the US. That was in particular because of domestic regulations in the US, but also because of a few innovations from banks. For instance, Midland Bank played a role, a bit of a forerunner in this. And so both French and German banks were involved in this. There is a very important, very nice PhD which has been written by Matthias Kemmerer. I don't know if he's here actually, but on the Deutsche Bank, and he also explained how German banks were not so much involved in euro currencies affairs in the 1960s, but very much in the euro bonds on the long-term side of this market. In the 1960s, Deutsche Bank was a very important player, actually one among the first in this part of this market. But in both cases, in French and German banks were quite heavily involved in this story. But in the 1960s, in both countries, there were also big changes going on domestically, usually because of changes in the regulation. And in France, in particular, in 1966-67, there were very important reforms under the finance ministry, Michel Debré. So in 2 years, they enacted 33 measures, and they changed the banking sector in the sense that they wanted to reintroduce competition. They wanted to reauthorize the combination of doing both like class deposit banking activities and investment banking activities. And also they liberalized the development of branching. So that's a moment where, which is often portrayed in France as a moment where many bakeries or small shops around the corners were turned into bank branches. And also in the context of the massification of the access to banking in French societies. But also in Germany, there were big changes in the regulatory environment, fostering competition between savings banks, cooperative banks, and commercial banks. And in 1967, the interest rates, interest rates based on deposits were also liberalized in Germany. So that's there were also big changes occurring at the national level. And in France, these changes were introduced also in the context of the coming end of the coming arrival of the common market. I mean, this was already there, but by 1968, the common market was supposed to be fully established. So there was clearly a European dimension in this story. And I just mentioned briefly, it's not exactly about French and banking and German banking sectors, strictly speaking, but just mentioned the Segre report, which is sometimes forgotten. But today in the discussions on Capital Markets Union, this is an interesting, very early discussion on these kind of issues. So the Segre report was issued by someone from the European Commission. So Claudio Segre was working in the Commission, then he went on to the private sector. And he chaired a group of experts reflecting on the development of a European capital market. So I just put a table of contents, which had a lot of things to say. It's quite a large report, but it did not have much impact at the time. But it provided a roadmap for future discussions when the commissions or private actors discussed with the authorities the possibilities of connecting stock exchanges or promoting some kind of European capital market. So it's a very early attempt. It's quite interesting actually to look at. So now moving on to the 1970s, late 60s, 1970s. For banking, this was very much a decade of internationalization. And this came in particular with what was often called in the literature the American Challenge, which started already in the 60s. The American Challenge being like American banks much bigger than European ones arriving in Europe and sometimes stealing the clientele of European banks, which at that time was perceived as not like a usual practice between gentlemen. So there was a lot of discussions on this. So the archives are also very full of information about how they reacted, what the ideas they had in mind. And one response was the creation of banking clubs. So banking clubs were kind of hybrid cooperative structures between banks, which try to cooperate, usually one bank per country, to try to face this American competition. Not only to face American competition, there was also some kind of following the European integration trend. And so one of them was already existing since the late 50s. It's Deutsche Bank, actually, which had been a prominent player in this. It was not called, it changed of name in the late 60s, but it existed all along the 60s, and it was reinforced in the 1970s, but others were founded in the 1970s. So here I put three big ones. EBIC had Deutsche Bank and Société Générale. Abeco had Dresdner Bank and Banque Nationale BNP, with other banks also. And Europartners guarded Commerzbank and Crédit Lyonnais. But there were other clubs. For instance, Inter Alpha in particular had the Berliner Handelsbank and the Crédit Commercial de France, and Unico had Crédit Agricole and DG Bank. So there were kind of attempts to how to for historians, it's a very interesting moment to see how there is this kind of trial and error process to how to face with both this international boom because of also of events occurring at the world level, like the oil shock at the end of Bretton Woods, but also the American competition and the European integration. So usually these clubs are portrayed as a failure or a disappointing experience, but for historians it's still an interesting, actually, experience because it's part of this kind of process of navigating through international banking. So this, like, just a few examples of because these clubs still existed in 1980s. Some of them lasted until Unico actually, I think, lasted until 2017, quite recently. Others were disbanded usually in the 1990s. So sometimes they focused on creating joint ventures, which were usually disappointing. Sometimes they focused more on training personnel, like trying to internationalize the staff. Sometimes they also worked on, for instance, the Abeco, the one on the right-hand side. They worked on gathering information, so trying to collect, to bring to pool experts in economics to pool a bit of information. But this came in competition, like in the end, multinationalization won over this kind of banking club approach, and most of big banks established like their own multinational network, and that's really starting on the second half of the 1970s and continuing even more in the 1980s. So, and this was so organized this was happening in the context of this new kind of financial world I mentioned, like the end of the Bretton Woods system, starting in 71 and really finishing in 73. And this there was also the oil shock a few years after. And with this new context came new risks. Of course, in Germany, there was a Hallstatt crisis in 1974, which was because of foreign exchange losses, and usually foreign exchange activities had boomed after the end of the Bretton Woods system because currencies had moved to flexibility, so flexible exchange rate. And the Erste Bank is very famous because it's supposed to have played a big role in the creation of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, because it was closed at the end of the working day in Germany, but not it was not the case in the US. But so it created kind of small crisis compared to the size of the bank. Just in the context. The European Commission was already starting to work on this project of a European common market in banking. It was very much tentative in the 1970s, but there was already some work going on and quite important discussions with commercial banks on this. And so arriving at the last moment, so the 1990s and early 1980s. So this decade started with international debt crisis, in which European banks were not so affected as American banks, which were much more exposed to Mexico, Brazil, these kind of countries. But it did play a role because it impacted also the American Congress, which asked for enforcement in regulation, and then this went back to the Basel Committee, and this also played a role as a demand for rising capital adequacy ratio on a worldwide level. An important moment in French history is a kind of U-turn in the financial policies in 1983. So the President Mitterrand had been elected in 1981. He was a socialist. He came with quite an ambitious socialist agenda. The entire banking sector was nationalized. And so that was a big change in French banking. But 2 years after, in 1983, under the pressure from the European monetary system, but also under pressure domestically of the French public debt, the government made a very strong turn. And the ideas, there's a very nice chapter on this by Olivier Feiertag, who really wrote on this, how the public debt was really critical in this change of orientation at the high level, in the prime minister and president level. So the idea was basically to liberalize the financial market in order to lower the cost of public debt. That was basically the idea. How to go out of the crisis? We have to reduce the price of indebtedness. Another part. So I'm going to finish almost with just one example. I'm going to skip the last example, but just a couple of examples on how German and French banks also connected on various discussions in the 1980s, and one of them is the question of European payment systems. And so German banks were particularly involved in this, in particular Deutsche Bank, but not only. In particular through the European Council for Payment System, which was a private-based organization created in 1977. And this was created and animated in particular again as a resisting move against what was perceived by some European banks as an invasion of US payment services companies like Visa and MasterCard. And for instance, this is how the press was perceiving it, like kind of Eurocard and Eurocheck organization were seen as a way to protect Europe from Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and the like. So the archives on these questions are quite interesting to look at, because it's connecting also to both global issues, various kind of players outside Europe, but German banks were quite involved in this, and so it's also relating to the rise of to the development of credit cards among the population in European societies. So I'm moving up. I'm like accelerate. This is just the same, and yeah. So the ECU was the last thing I wanted to illustrate. It's something which is actually a different experience on French and German side. The private ECU was something which was mirroring the public ECU. ECU is European Currency Unit. It was part of the European monetary system, but private banks imitated the public ECU, which had been created within this monetary system, and used it as a financial innovation, basically to propose a product which could shelter against variability of currencies. It could diversify portfolios. Also, it could be used in various ways, but French banks and Italian banks and British banks were particularly involved in this, particularly because they had the authorities were backing very much this market, whereas German authorities were quite reluctant in this. So German banks did not really got involved in this market before the late 1980s. But by 1990, they were also playing a big role in this. So it was some kind of rehearsal from some kind of. It was also close to the idea of a common currency or something which should be similar to this. So I'm going to finish on this, and so what is interesting is when we look at these at the history of these two country banking sectors, it's also the persistence of national patterns. The role of national regulatory apparatus and the more global economic policies surrounding, so it's basically the global context of what is occurring in both countries. And I think the next presentation will talk maybe more about this kind of relationship with the monetary union issues. And the lopsided economic monetary union was the name of a project I worked in before. And the North American competition, and something which I didn't talk so much, but which I think should be more developed in the French side, and particularly it's a history of savings banks and cooperative banks, which is much less regarded in the academic research. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for talking a bit too long.
Grand merci. Thank you very much for this overview of the developments in the second half of the 20th century. Questions on that? Yeah. So.
Thank you very much. Christoph Friedrich, a former Commerzbank economist. And thank you very much for mentioning also the currencies, and the ECU is of course a good example, but my first question is, do you see an influence of the strength of the D-Mark on the development of the two banking systems? Because it was not only Deutsche Bank that was very strong in the issuance of D-Mark bonds. And second question, since 1818, there is a livret A in France, as I hope that's right, and Caisse de Consignation et de Dépôt. And so this French state, until today, has direct access to a large part of the national savings. My question is not about that. My question is that the reason why France did not regret to have privatized its savings banks?
Okay. So regarding the influence of Deutsche Mark, it's very much. I think it played very much a big role, and it seemed to me also based on this the research, for instance, by Matthias Kammerer, on that it was a kind of an agreement between authorities and banks to rely on the strengths of the Deutsche Mark to develop this kind of monopoly in the Deutsche Mark affairs, also internationally, which was a very strong dimension of German banking when it was internationally oriented, and it was definitely not restricted to Deutsche Bank. This is for sure. I think it played a very big role, and in this case there is an interesting agreement, somehow informal agreement somehow between authorities and banking sector also, which is quite interesting also to consider. Regarding the second question, did you mention that the Caisse de Dépôt? Is it okay? Yeah. So is it a reason why? I'm not sure actually. I don't know for the savings banks question. If it's your question was is it about is it a reason why it accepted the privatization of? I wouldn't know. I would not like to say something I'm not sure of. So I would say the honest answer is I'm not sure. I don't know, but it could be.
Thank you. There's another question over here.
Thank you. Max Kuchenbuch, UBS. And we recently, not 3 years ago, we had to merge with a French bank. And something I observed was really striking is that the connectiveness of the insurance sector with the banking sector in France. And two elements I observed. For example, you don't have a mortgage in France. So you don't pledge your immovable property as a collateral, but you sign an insurance on your house and you buy the insurance from a subsidiary of the bank, which is an insurance company. Yeah. And the other element is the life insurance policies, which is a main saving element in France. And I think these two elements are very unique and different to Germany. And maybe you can give us a bit of background of the reason for this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's actually quite interesting. I recently talked with, in various research I've made with former supervisors or in the archives, this idea that in France there was an attempt to develop like a bank assurance, like a banking absorbing insurances, whereas in Germany it was more about insurance banking, like insurances trying to do banking activities. And according to the person I was talking to, like, it had been more successful in the case of the bank assurance, so basically banking using, being very close to doing insurance activities. So it is something which has been quite developed in France. The bank assurance is something which is we see it quite a lot in the archives. In the 1980s, it starts. I see it as something quite developing. And I'm not. I wanted to say something else, but I just forgot. I don't know if how much it answers your question, but it will maybe come back later.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we run already behind schedule. I see Philippe ODDO, who has become more German than the Germans. He was there at 4:15. Bill, So I think we have to continue with the coffee break. Thank you very much, Alexis, for this.